We are very lucky at the Hub to be guided by a panel of experts, including Professor Suzanne Becken, who presented our last webinar that looked at redesigning and redefining tourism, focusing on what was happening in New Zealand. Today's webinar follows on by looking at the systems change in the tourism sector. The events of the past year have had severe impacts on tourism globally, revealing major shortcomings and vulnerabilities. In the past, weaknesses in the system have been disregarded in favour of promises of short-term economic development and growth. In this webinar, it is argued that transformational change is required to rethink the tourism system. We're lucky today to be joined by Dr. Johanna Loehr. We have worked with her on a past project last year. She has just completed her doctorate with Griffith University and is here today to present her research on reducing climate risk to destinations in the South Pacific using systems thinking. System thinking looks at overall structures, patterns and cycles of a system rather than focusing on specific events. Dr. Loehr will discuss her concerns about solutions commonly used to address sustainability issues and put forward potential solutions for transformational systems-wide change in a coastal destination vulnerable to climate change, such as the Whitsundays. Johanna is going to provide a 20-minute presentation, and at the end of the presentation, we will have time for questions. Please keep your microphones muted during the presentation. You may also like to turn off your video to get a higher quality connection. You can use the chat function to type in any questions and we will go through those questions at the end. And we are recording this webinar, so it will be available very soon on the Whitsunday Climate Change Innovation Hub website. So we'll go straight into Johanna's presentation. Thanks for joining us, Johanna.
Thanks, Olivia. So let me share my screen. Great, can you see that? Perfect. Right, thanks for having me, Olivia, and for the introduction. So as Olivia said, my talk today focuses on system change in destinations through different leverage points, and I'll explain what those leverage points or what leverage points are. As Olivia said, my presentation is informed by my PhD, where the focus was on system change to reduce climate change risk in Vanuatu destinations, but I'll try and keep it general enough or make links to what that means for other destinations, including the Whitsundays. Why are we even talking about system change? Olivia, I'm getting a bit of a feedback. I don't know if maybe if you mute yourself, or if others haven't muted themselves, that might help. So why are we even talking about system change? Before COVID hit, the argument was that tourism in small island developing states and other coastal destinations is highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Tourism in many cases is also quite resource intense. And in Vanuatu, the majority of tourists come by plane or cruise ship from Australia, New Zealand and Europe, so quite a far distance away. And that in itself bears a high risk to future changes in carbon policy or in behaviour change. Despite those risks, Vanuatu invested in tourism with the hope to improve people's lives. And to ensure that tourism can act as a sustainable development option and deliver real benefits to the local people, my argument was that climate change risk needs to be addressed. So this is basically where I'm coming from. So now with COVID, that international tourism is on hold almost globally, there is a concern that maybe it is not only the location that's vulnerable, but tourism as an industry is vulnerable to certain shocks. This stop on tourism, or this halt we're experiencing, leaves many to demand this moment to be used to address the shortfalls of tourism, and people are questioning if the costs, so environmental and social, that tourism brings with it outweigh the benefits tourism creates. In the last webinar that was hosted by the Climate Change Hub, Johanna was saying that if not now, will tourism ever change? So in this context, many agree with this need for transformation. And, transformation is a word that's, been used quite frequently in recent time. Transformational change has been defined using words such as significant, profound, radical, and fundamental. And transformation is a process. It's not describing an outcome, but it can lead to what we would perceive as either a negative change or outcome or a positive one. So important is that transformation refers to the depth of change. And clear is also that to achieve such change, we cannot revert back to business as usual. So the problem with change, especially such deep change, is that it's not easy to implement. And I thought this was a pretty good illustration to reflect, some of the challenges. So how to address those complex problems that we're facing or that destinations are facing? And, obviously climate change is one of them, but there are others. Sustainability challenges, resilience, something that Olivia mentioned, is a focus of the hub, but also the COVID recovery. And, how can we inform such transformational change? A way of better understanding complex problems is through systems thinking. The issue is that often we see a problem as an event or a situation at this present moment in time and act by finding solutions to this particular situation by addressing the problem's symptoms. So for example, like building a seawall when we're experiencing flooding or even by moving to higher grounds. However, in doing so, we fail to address the underlying cause of the problem. So that could be sea level rise or climate change, overconsumption or, even population growth if we're sort of, taking a wider angle. Systems thinking provides us with a bigger picture of the situation and helps us understand the structure and behavior of our systems that causes those problems or events to happen. Systems thinking therefore helps us to shift our approach from reacting to problems to becoming more proactive and anticipatory. So I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with systems thinking. So I'm just providing a really brief overview of how it can be applied to destinations, because my next sort of points build on systems ideas. So as part of my PhD, I learned how important it is to view destinations, including tourism businesses, but also the local community and environment, as an interconnected whole. And of course, there's also more specific elements that make up a destination system, including socioeconomic and political processes that will need to be considered. So this is because only when we see it as this whole, or through a holistic lens, can we identify interventions that don't create negative or unintended consequences to other parts of the system. And developing such a system allows us to identify what elements the system is made up of, how those elements interlink, and what feedback loops create system behavior. And this is important because it helps us to answer those questions that you can see here. So what systemic changes are needed? What system characteristics enable or restrict such change? And based on this, identify how to intervene. And so the remainder of this presentation will focus on the last question. And I do think that it adds on well from the previous presentation, where there was a bit of interest and discussion around finding levers for change. So in systems, places to intervene where small change can have a large effect are called leverage points. And as part of my PhD, I spend a lot of time thinking about leverage points and, in my case, points to intervene in Vanuatu destination systems to reduce climate change risk. I do want to point out that this, this work or those thoughts are built on, existing thinking around leverage points in systems more generally. So today I want to talk about 7 leverage points for system change in destinations, and I'll start at the shallow end. So that means with leverage points that are easier to implement, but change is rather small or incremental, and then move towards deeper leverage points, which are more difficult to implement, as you will notice, but they have the potential to achieve significant system change or transformational change. Again, the leverage points, they focus on climate change risks to destinations in Vanuatu, and I put that in brackets because really, some of those lessons are, or ideas are certainly relevant to other destinations as well. So starting at the shallow end, the first 2 leverage points or levers are to change the parameters of the system, so in forms of numbers and standards. And the first way to do that, or example to do that, is to enhance the integration of tourism and climate change policies. And again, I'm referring to climate change here, but if the focus is on conservation of biodiversity, then that would most likely apply as well. So the integration of tourism and climate change policies. In Vanuatu, Vanuatu actually has more recently released a new sustainable tourism policy, which gets that links or integration between tourism and climate change quite well. But there is still a need to ensure that tourism is represented in national climate change policies and plans, including being identified in those climate change documents as a priority area. And this is something to consider for other destinations, including the Whitsundays as well. And it's not just relevant for national documents, but also at local level. And so when I talk about integration, it means that a climate change plan or policy considers tourism in their priorities or objectives and actions, and tourism plans and policies consider climate change. And of course, also that tourism policy directions, goals and targets, such as growing tourist numbers, don't contradict with any of the climate change targets that have been set. And in many cases, this is actually quite common that those don't align. So the next leverage point is to look at funding mechanisms or sources for climate risk reduction in tourism. There are different sources internally or through external funds, especially in Vanuatu. The recommendation was to strengthen system mechanisms that focus or strengthen those internal mechanisms that allow a trickling down of funding to on-the-ground small businesses. So, for example, through small grant schemes. Funding mechanisms are different in the Whitsundays, obviously, and the Whitsundays is not reliant on aid, but it's generally important to be aware of the conditions or interests attached to funding and the mechanisms of how funding is distributed and whether that aligns with what you want this funding to achieve. And again, this is relevant to climate change, but also for other areas. So, may it be regenerative tourism or any other sort of sustainability focused projects. So moving on, the next leverage point focuses on changing system feedback loops. And this, again, is system terminology, so my apologies. Feedback loops either reinforce or balance the behavior of a system. And so understanding and then changing those feedback loops can be quite powerful. One example is for tourism to work with nature rather than against it, to strengthen ecosystem health, basically. And this has a lot of positive flow-on effects to the wider destination. So an example, a climate change specific example would be for tourism to invest in or implement ecosystem-based adaptation. So ecosystem-based adaptation is our initiatives or an approach that strengthens ecosystem that naturally provide a buffer and reduce climate change risks. So, for example, revegetating coastal areas, or also actively increasing the health and resilience of a coral reef. And this is because as these ecosystems grow stronger and healthier, the ecosystems are less susceptible to damage from climate change, which then again increases their ability to provide a buffer function. And then again, healthy ecosystems also help increase destination attractiveness and provide a lot of other ecosystem services that have flow-on effects to the destination. So these are definitely also relevant for many other coastal destinations, and including the Whitsundays. So the next two leverage points, and I'm moving sort of towards more deeper leverage points, is to change the design of the system, so the destination system. And that can be done, for example, by changing the information flow through developing networks across sectors and decision-making levels, for example. Getting people from tourism and other sectors to exchange information and sitting together and developing strategies. Also, and this might be more applicable to Vanuatu, investing in education and development of destination-specific data around, climate information. And this is really because there is not a lot of, knowledge and understanding within the tourism sector of what businesses can do to address some of those climate change risks. So really that can help increase capacities. Then the next leverage point is to increase local participation, decision-making and tourism. In Vanuatu currently, foreign investment and decision-making is really high. However, empowering local people, including women, to participate and influence tourism development and destination has a lot of positive benefits and changes how elements are linked and really the structure of the system. It improves self-organization, and it was also argued that it can contribute to the flexibility of people, variability between destinations, and in a way contribute to resilience towards climate change. And I guess in a way, this can be questioned now with COVID, especially in cases like Vanuatu where there's no tourists. However, in a way, giving people, local people decision-making power, still provides agency. And of course, it also means that benefits that are generated through tourism go to those people directly, and that those people can determine what shape those benefits might take. So when I was thinking about, those leverage points and how they might relate to the Whitsundays, I thought that in terms of changing system design, or how some of those system elements link, it could also be useful to review what products are offered and to whom. So who's actually coming to the destination? Are these domestic tourists or international? And whether that makes a difference in system links and feedbacks. And I do have a little, anecdote from the Whitsundays actually. So I went on a sailboat in October to do like a sailing trip in the Whitsundays, and the boat I went on, there was two other couples as guests, and the operator and captain told us that this tour, so it was a longer tour, 2 days and 4 nights and I think 4 days, around that. And the captain said that this actually is a new format now that they have only implemented after COVID to cater for domestic tourists. He was telling us that before they received a lot of international tourists, and their tours were only 2 nights and 2 days, roughly, or 3 days, but 2 nights. And that meant that they were doing several tours a week, not just one long tour. It meant that the crew had a lot less time at home, with social replications. The tours were rushed, so they were always going to the same places, those must-see attractions, because that's what people wanted to see. And they were saying that now that they have different type of visitors, their tours look very different, and it has a positive impact on their families and also the way they conduct their tours, because they have a lot more time to go to different anchorages. They have a lot more time. They have a lot more time sailing. So again, I don't even want to, expand on this much more, but it just shows that there's those flow-on effects and links that are created just because all of a sudden they're receiving domestic tourists who are willing to spend a bit more time. And so then moving on to the deepest leverage points, which are focused on changing system intent. And this can be done by changing the goals of the system. Often people are frustrated with the outcomes systems produce, and in many instances this is not due to faulty system design, but because the goals are defined wrongly. So in the context of reducing climate change risk and increasing resilience, reflecting on or redefining goals for the system may include asking questions such as, what a resilience of what, or for whom, and why do we want to be resilient? And for a broader context of tourism development, or to rethink tourism in the face of COVID, those questions that could be asked may include, what do we actually want tourism for? So obviously, these questions are not easy to answer, and obviously there'll be varied viewpoints on what the correct answers are. One thing I think that became really clear to me when I did my climate change study is that if the goal, the system goal is to grow GDP, it won't help address climate change. So instead, a focus on creating community well-being under a changing climate will generate really different system outcomes. So the way the goal is defined and importantly measured is really important and often overlooked, I think. And so the final and deepest leverage point is to shift paradigms. And this is because the underlying paradigm determines system structure, behavior, and intent, and therefore influences all the previous leverage points that I talked about. Vanuatu is unique as its traditional custom culture is still really strong. However, there are also high expectations for people to participate in the global cash economy. And Western capitalism has influenced policies and also how tourism is developed. And this has implications, including implications for climate change and climate change risk reduction, because there is a strong push for growth and development of coastal properties and people moving to probably those exposed and more vulnerable locations, and moving away from their land and things like that. So one thing I've learned from doing my PhD in Vanuatu is that when it comes to values and worldviews that may help us address climate change, we have a lot to learn from the Indigenous peoples of the South Pacific, as they have an intrinsic understanding of how the human and environmental elements of our system link. I have less experience working with Indigenous people in Australia, but I am quite sure that they would have a similar view about the human and environmental relationship. And Susanna mentioned that some examples from the Maoris in New Zealand in her webinar as well that reflected this. So for Vanuatu particularly, but also for us here, I do think that there is an opportunity to incorporate this more holistic understanding to inform tourism development and to create broader benefits through tourism. So what does this mean for the Whitsundays? We can have a discussion about this if you like, if there's any questions, or You can also think about this further in your own time, but here are a few pointers or questions. And generally, I guess to recap, recent times have highlighted that there is a need to transform the tourism system, but change can go in many directions. And what is perceived as positive or negative outcomes varies between people and interest groups. So not everyone, has the same views on what is a good change or system outcome. So we need to be clear on who's part of the destination system, and we can be thinking local stakeholders, or including children, if you want to go as far as even talking about future generations. That's often done in climate change, or including nature as part of this system. We've heard that from Johanna that New Zealand is increasingly doing this, and what the varying priorities are of those system elements. And then, are there any trade-offs between those priorities? Also important to think about is what outcomes should the tourism or destination system actually produce? There are different countries and cities who are looking at expanding or redefining what they consider successful development or successful economic outcomes. So there's a lot of thinking happening in this space. And is this in line with the actual current net outcomes that tourism delivers? So net outcomes, because it's important to consider both the positive and negative outcomes or impacts that tourism has. If not, it might help to look at if the goals that were set for tourism in the Whitsundays, or more broadly, at council for the community, or any others, goals. What are they, and what is actually measured and reported on? And I think this should hopefully give you an indication of what drives decisions and ultimately influences system design and function. And that is all that I have to share with you today. But obviously, if there's any questions or comments, I'm more than happy to keep the discussion going. Or even later on, if there's anything that you want to ask, feel free to reach out to me directly or via Olivia. Thank you.
Yeah, everyone should be able to unmute themselves now. So thank you, Johanna. That was really interesting. I certainly got another way of thinking about how we can potentially do the exact opposite of what I've been focusing on, which is integrating climate change through all the other plans and bringing tourism back this way as well. So that's very interesting. Does anybody have any questions for Johanna on anything she's presented today? No?
People might need a moment to think about it.
Yeah, sure. So I suppose I'll ask a question then. Sure. So all of the ideas you've provided, how do you think they could also be used to inform tourism recovery in response to COVID?
Yeah, so obviously, that's a big question. I think a lot of people are thinking about tourism recovery at the moment. So because there has been such a drastic change and stop, in a way, to tourism, it's a good time to really take a moment to reflect and take stock, and even as a community talk about some of those fundamental questions that I've mentioned, like what do we want tourism for, or what do we want out of it, what is it currently delivering, and is there what type of change do we need? So I think those fundamental questions to reflect on what tourism was like and where it might need to go or should go, I think is quite important, and probably a good time now to have those discussions and to involve the community. So something else that I've learned from my climate change studies, and Olivia, you may experience that as well, is that it's really important to involve a wide range of stakeholders. So it's quite obvious to talk to tourism stakeholders, tourism businesses, but if we're looking at this from a whole of destination perspective, you know, I found it's quite important to include, you know, community representatives and maybe even, yeah, you know, sectors that sort of link to tourism, different types of community representatives to ensure different groups are represented. And having those different viewpoints also helps to really look at things more holistically, because people would look at it through their different lenses and understanding of the destination. So I think that's quite important to point out. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of, I mean, I've framed this all around system and the destination being a system, but, you know, beyond that, I think there's this recognition that there is a tourism system and that this system needs to change now with what happened with COVID. So I think using that systems or more holistic lens to look at how tourism is linked with other sectors and the community, and is quite useful actually to identify some opportunities for change.
Did anyone else have a question for Johanna?
Yeah, it's Al Grundy here. The one of the points that I find interesting is about the environmental and social questions, and the suggestion that tourism's doing damage. And it's really interesting because I know here for the Whitsundays that the majority of the operators are the ones that want to take the lead, and they're the ones that are, if you like, the eyes on what's happening, and they're also the ones that are most concerned about the change that's being experienced. And I think as we move forward, that it's these operators and these tourism people that are investing and the staff that are working in tourism that are our hope. So I think we need to be very careful how we react to that, because there is a general suggestion that all the damage is being done. It's just you tourism operators that are causing the issue, and that's, you know, and I think it's actually the reverse if you actually peel back a few layers of the onion, and the tourism industry is the way that we can really move forward. Maybe more of a comment than anything, but I think, you know, some of the frameworks that we've had through ecotourism and climate adaptation and other programs that have been run have set us in a good position. We're not there yet, but we're working in partnership with the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority and Queensland Parks and the community. And I think while we've got a long way to go, we've forged quite a good partnership, and we're starting on the correct way forward, and policies being changed to reflect that as well.
Yeah, that's a really good and important comment. And I mean, to be fair, you know, I didn't mean to say that, you know, the tourism operators are creating, you know, all the problems. I think it's, from my point of view, looking at this, you know, from a very big picture, and, you know, what's happening in Vanuatu with, you know, being reliant on international tourism and climate change, you know, that, yeah, that at a large scale there is an impact through carbon emissions, but there's obviously also a lot of good examples where operators are doing really, you know, good work. And I know there are a lot of good examples in the Whitsundays. A lot of work, you know, has been done and is being done. And Olivia's told me before that, you know, there is a real interest and, you know, from operators and a real awareness, and that probably sets the Whitsundays apart from other destinations as well. So yeah, I do appreciate that comment. And I think that idea, and maybe that goes back to some of the, you know, examples that Susanna provided in her webinar of using tourism to create, you know, more holistic or positive outcomes. And this is something that, you know, the direction I kind of wanted to go with this as well is, yeah, you know, how can tourism be used to create those benefits to the wider destination, to the community, and have positive benefits on the environment. So it's great to hear that, you know, there's a lot that's been done or that's already happening in your case.
Tash, did you have a question?
Hey, Olivia, I've got a question, if that's all right.
Sure.
Johanna, thanks for the presentation. I'm Tony Fonts. I'm with the Sunday Conservation Council. And following on to Al's comment regarding tourism, tourism certainly are the cheerleaders for the reef, but I think tourism can do more in the climate change field. And I'm wondering if you've got suggestions on how we can get our tourism industry to be more vocal, more outspoken in regards to protecting the reef from the impacts of climate change, because they're a powerful force when united, but we have failed to, I think, really take advantage of that when it comes to moving government policy and climate change in this country.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And yeah, I think I mean I think we can all agree that there's a need to move climate change policy in the country, so at at higher decision making levels. And I think tourism is an important industry in Australia. I do think there is some opportunities to leverage of that, and obviously, and you would all understand the reef and just generally ecosystem health is really important to a successful tourism industry. So yeah, how to leverage that to achieve policy change at a national level, that's obviously a big question. And I think there was similar questions after Susanna's webinar as well, in terms of governance and what a local destination can do to sort of achieve or have an impact at that level. Yeah, I'm not too sure yet, but there's certainly interesting questions. And I do think that examples show that, if there's momentum and people sort of unite behind a strong or common purpose, and that could be to address climate change or protect the reef, that others do take notice.
Right, do we have any other final questions before we sign off today? All right, well, thank you, Johanna, for providing us a very thought-provoking presentation. I hope everyone's got a few little things that they're going to think about a little bit more. If anybody does want to provide any other feedback on the webinar, please send us an email. We are really interested to understand if you are benefiting from these webinars and how you think the systems thinking could be applied to the recovery of the Whitsunday destination or other destinations or your own businesses. The Hub is working with council and industry on mitigating and adapting to climate change. And if you're interested in any more information on the Climate Hub, you can head to our website, Whitsunday Climate Change Innovation Hub, or follow us on Facebook. As I said earlier, we're going to share a recording soon. There's a website tab on the Hub's website that has all of our past webinars, and we will intend to keep digging into this topic a little bit further, and we'll release some more information shortly on our next webinar. So thank you very much to everyone for joining us today, and thanks, Johanna, for presenting.
Thanks, Olivia, and thanks everyone for joining and your great questions and comments.
Thank you. Thanks for arranging, Liv.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Thank you.
Well done, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.